Hey guys, tonight's journey might test your stomach a little, so if you're eating, maybe just pause for a bit. Or at least, don't eat anything brown and lumpy, because we're about to descend into one of the least glamorous, most misunderstood, and absolutely vital jobs in medieval life: the gong farmer. Yes, the guy who literally shoveled human waste for a living. So before we light our lantern and climb down into a cesspit, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. Now, dim the lights, maybe crack a window. You'll be glad for the fresh air in a few minutes. And let's ease into tonight's journey. Not up, not forward, but down. Down into the stone pits beneath the city. Down into the foul-smelling, bubbling underworld of medieval sanitation. Down to the man crouched in the dark, waist-deep in other people's bad decisions. Because while the kings held banquets, and the monks lit candles, and the nobles complained about the weather, someone else was keeping the city from literally drowning in its own filth. He didn't wear a crown, he didn't read Latin, he didn't even get to walk through town during daylight hours. But without him, the entire medieval world would have reeked its way straight into oblivion. So tonight we ask the question few dare to say out loud: what was it actually like to be a gong farmer? Let's begin with a simple image. It's a grey midnight in medieval London, maybe 1437, and the city above is silent except for the slosh of the Thames, a distant bark, and the sound of boots on uneven cobblestone. Lanterns flicker, casting fat yellow shadows over timber and stone. Somewhere beneath this patchwork of houses, alehouses, and leaning tenements, a man climbs out of a pit, shoulders stooped, breathing hard. He wipes something dark from his brow and leans for a moment against the cold wall, catching his breath, not caring that the wall is as filthy as his hands. He is the most important person in the city tonight. He is also, by common agreement, the most disgusting. His name is lost to history. Maybe it was Jack, or Will, or the kind of nickname you only whisper after 3 ales. But everyone in London knows his profession, and everyone pretends not to see him. He is a gong farmer, and his work is the reason London doesn't stink so badly you can't breathe. At least, not all of the time. Now, before we get poetic about the daily grind of medieval life, let's get one thing out of the way. The word gong isn't just a noise you make with a big metal drum. Not here. In the language of the English Middle Ages, gong is what you do after dinner. It's from the Old English word gang, to go, as in I need to go. If you've ever slipped away from a crowded banquet and muttered something about needing to go, congratulations, you're speaking the ancient tongue. And the gong farmer is the man who comes after you, quite literally, to clean up your going. But his work isn't just cleaning up after the privileged few in manor houses and castles. No, in the teeming, sweating, breathing mass of the medieval city, every person, duke or beggar, produces waste. Not politely wrapped and sealed modern plumbing, but raw, unfiltered, undiluted. It seeps beneath homes, it pools in dark cellars, it slides down stone chutes behind monasteries, and it festers in privy vaults dug deep into the ground. The medieval cesspit is a force of nature in its own right, and the only thing keeping it from rising up and conquering the city is a man with a shovel and a strong constitution. If you're picturing the modern sanitation worker, forget it. Gong farmers operate in a world before any city planner had dreamed up the grid, the sewer, the flush toilet, or even the idea of regular waste removal. In medieval London, for example, almost every house had its own cesspit, essentially a stone-lined hole in the ground into which all the household waste was dumped. If you were lucky, it was a few feet deep and lined with bricks. If you weren't, it was just a muddy trench beneath the floorboards, steadily filling up month after month, winter and summer, no matter what the wind or rain was doing. Now and then, these pits needed emptying. At first, you could try to ignore the smell. Hang sprigs of rosemary above the door, maybe burn a candle near the privy seat. But denial only gets you so far when the air starts to taste sour and the walls sweat with moisture that isn't quite rainwater. The family dog stops going near the trapdoor. Then, one day, the pit beneath the house is so full it's backing up into the kitchen. You've reached what we might call the medieval crisis point. It is at this point that the household's dignity, however battered, is abandoned, and a request is sent out quietly in the dark. We need a gong farmer. And so, as if summoned by some unholy bat signal, the city's least wanted but most necessary man arrives with a set of tools designed for a job nobody else wants to do, and a look of someone who has seen things no one else should. Gong farmers were not merely lowly labourers. In fact, theirs was a strange kind of status, hovering in a shadowland between necessary evil and absolute pariah. Cities needed them, and for their work, they were paid more than most field labourers, sometimes even more than skilled tradesmen. In a time when most people scrape by on a penny a day, a gong farmer could command a much higher wage for a single night's work. But money, as any of them would have told you, does not buy you respect when you're covered in the worst London has to offer. The duties were many, and almost all revolting. They arrived after dark, not for the drama, but because the law required it. The smell was bad enough, but the sight of the process would have driven half the neighbourhood to a fainting fit. Only the bravest or most desperate went out to do it. The work began with opening the heavy wooden trapdoor, if it hadn't already rotted away, then shining a lantern down into the blackness. The first thing to hit you wasn't the sight, it was the smell. Describing the smell of a medieval cesspit is, thankfully, beyond the capabilities of language. But let's try. Imagine every foul odour you've ever encountered. The worst public toilet, a compost bin in July, a dead rat in the heat, mould, rot, mildew, and the metallic edge of old blood. Now concentrate all those scents, then multiply by the number of people who've lived in your house for the last 5 years. Let it ferment, and that's the starting point. Climbing into the pit was a job for the strong and the stupidly brave. Some pits were large enough to stand in, others so tight you had to crouch or even lie on your side. The floor was often a gelatinous soup, sometimes so thick it would hold the weight of a man for a moment, sometimes so thin you'd sink to your shins. At best, it was just solid enough to scoop. At worst, it was like wading through the world's worst stew, and every movement released new fumes that threatened to knock you out cold. The tools were simple. There was the shovel, the scoop, the bucket, wooden, leather, sometimes just an old cauldron pressed into service. Ropes were essential for lowering and hauling the buckets up to ground level. Sometimes an assistant would stand above, hauling and emptying the loads into larger barrels or carts waiting on the street. Gong farmers often worked in teams, the more efficient to clear a pit before dawn, before the rest of the city rose and realized what was happening beneath their feet. But the dangers were real. Medieval cesspits were breeding grounds for every disease known to man, and a few that seem to have vanished mercifully into history. Typhus, dysentery, cholera, and worse. The pits themselves belched out gases, methane, ammonia, hydrogen sulfide. Some of these could kill you. It wasn't unknown for a careless gong farmer to drop dead on the job, suffocated by the invisible clouds swirling at the pit's bottom. More than one worker fainted, fell, and drowned in the filth. Sometimes, when a pit had been left too long, the pressure of gases could actually blow the contents back up through the seat, coating the unlucky householder who tried to investigate. Yet for all these dangers, the work continued, night after night, year after year. The city demanded it. Without the steady, unsung work of the gong farmers, London, York, Bristol, and every other medieval town would have become unlivable. In summer, the pits swelled and overflowed, the streets thick with flies, the air heavy with a stench so powerful it made the eyes water. In winter, the contents froze, sometimes bursting the walls of the pit and sending cracks through the foundations of entire houses. What made a man take up such work? Sometimes it was the only thing available. For others, the pay was too good to ignore, especially if you had no reputation to protect. A few may have even felt a strange sort of pride in their work. After all, when a wealthy merchant or noble's home was at risk of flooding, it was the gong farmer who saved the day, not the mayor or the priest. But if any pride was felt, it was hidden under layers of shame and the relentless, inescapable odor. Gong farmers were forced to live apart from others, often in the poorest quarters or near the dumps and waste grounds outside the city walls. There are stories, possibly exaggerated, of mothers warning their children to stay away from the man with the bucket, as if he were a living ghost. If a gong farmer entered a tavern for a pint after work, the seats around him would mysteriously empty. Even their own families sometimes kept their distance, not just because of the smell, but out of fear that the gods themselves might notice the association and visit some new disaster in the household. To be a gong farmer was to live on the edge of society. Not quite an outcast, but never really inside the circle of community either. Their work was essential, but their presence was unwanted. Some cities tried to regulate them, requiring licenses or badges. Others simply ignored them, except when it was time to pay. Medieval records list fines for gong farmers who dumped waste in the wrong places or worked during daylight hours. There were even rules about where they could travel, often only at night and only along certain streets, to prevent the spread of disease and, perhaps more importantly, to keep the rest of the city from seeing what happened to its waste. The job itself changed little over the centuries. Whether in the reign of Henry IV or Elizabeth I, the basic process was the same. The pits filled, the call went out, the farmer came, and the waste was hauled away, usually to be dumped outside the city walls, on fields that would later grow the very crops everyone would eat come spring. Nothing, in the end, was wasted. The medieval economy was a circle, and the gong farmer stood at its dirtiest, most essential point. Even the tools of the trade told a story. Lanterns were prized possessions, both for the light they gave and for the small comfort they brought in the darkness below. A good rope, strong enough to haul up a full bucket, could mean the difference between finishing the job and joining the muck forever. Some gong farmers adopted tricks of the trade, stuffing rags with herbs into their noses, rubbing strong vinegar on their skin to mask the odor, or wearing extra layers that could be peeled off and burned after each shift. But the truth was, the smell never left. It followed you home, soaked into your hair, your skin, your breath. Even the best paid farmer could never quite scrub away the memory of a night spent face to face with the city's worst. There are old jokes in medieval literature about gong farmers never needing a dog because no thief would dare approach their house. As for the psychological toll, it must have been immense. To know that your work was essential, but to be shunned for doing it. To live each day with the knowledge that your labor kept thousands safe, but that no one would ever thank you for it. There are no saints of sanitation in the medieval calendar, no feasts for the man with the bucket, no prayers for the soul of the pit worker. Just another night, another pit, another dawn spent washing your hands and hoping, for once, the wind blows the other way. The city transforms at night. In the medieval world, nighttime isn't just the absence of light, it's a different reality. By sunset, London or York or Bristol empties of noise. The markets fall silent, taverns shutter their windows, and the narrow lanes grow eerily still, except for the distant clatter of a watchman's staff or the soft howl of a hungry mongrel. It is in this thick, moonlit silence that the true labour of the city begins, not the weaving, the baking, or the hammering of iron, but the dark, urgent work below the streets. To be a gong farmer is to be a creature of night, moving through a city that wants desperately not to remember you exist. Most ordinary citizens are already behind closed doors by the time the farmers emerge. Even thieves and cutpursers tend to avoid the gong farmer's route, not out of fear, but out of a kind of repulsed superstition, the sense that nothing good can come of crossing paths with a man who makes his living in other people's waste. If the medieval world has an underclass, then the gong farmer is its king, moving with quiet authority through alleys and backyards no one else dares enter after dark. The work begins long before the first shovel meets muck. As soon as the last hint of twilight fades, the city's gong farmers assemble at the edge of their assigned wards. There is a ritual to this gathering, a hurried meal in a smoky, low-ceilinged room, sleeves rolled up, boots laced tightly. The youngest among them, those with the freshest lungs and the fewest blisters, are sent out ahead to check the night's list. City officials, anxious not to be caught with overflowing pits, keep detailed records of which houses need attention and which streets must be avoided due to construction, or, more often, a recent outbreak of plague. Tonight's work is a mystery. The stench has already announced itself before the farmers even arrive. Still, someone must knock quietly at the house, mutter a quick greeting to the householder, and receive a nervous nod before being shown the way in. The tools are carried in sacks and on shoulders, a battered lantern, an old rope coiled around the arm, a shovel with its scarred handle, buckets stacked and rattling like a macabre percussion section. Each tool has its story, its dents and splinters, and perhaps for the luckiest, the faded marks of a previous owner who survived long enough to retire. There is a kind of camaraderie among the gong farmers that no other trade shares. Bakers and brewers work side by side, but their minds are on the day ahead. The bustle, the crowds, the praise for a well-baked loaf or a strong mug of ale. Gong farmers, by contrast, form bonds in darkness. They speak in quiet voices, share black humor, and trust each other with a kind of wordless understanding that comes only from facing danger together. A new recruit is watched closely for signs of weakness, not just fear of the filth, but fear of the night itself. If you panic underground, you're a threat to everyone. The work itself is governed by a choreography older than memory. Once inside, the farmers move silently, careful not to wake the sleeping household. The lantern is set down gently, its flame flickering over rough beams and the yawning mouth of the pit. Every sound is magnified, the scrape of iron on stone, the slosh of water, the low, involuntary groan of someone forced to kneel near the opening. The darkness feels alive, pressing close and thick, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Descending into the pit is a private ritual, an act of surrender to a world with its own laws. The rope is double-checked, knotted and re-knotted, and the ladder tested for rot. 1 foot after another, you slide down, the light above receding, the air growing colder and heavier with each step. The walls close in, damp and slick, sometimes carved with hasty symbols, protection against misfortune, or perhaps simply graffiti from another sleepless night. The first moments are always the hardest. The air at the bottom is dense, suffocating, shot through with a rankness that seems to cling to your very thoughts. Each breath is a battle. Some farmers carry cloths soaked in vinegar or pressed with mint, jammed against their upper lip. But after a minute or two, the odor overwhelms even the strongest concoctions. Down here, smell loses all meaning. It's just something you swim through. Shoveling begins in rhythm. Scoop, lift, tip, repeat. The work is slow and methodical. The waste must be loosened first, hacked apart with the edge of the blade, then worked into manageable chunks. Some farmers swear by certain techniques, chopping a circle around the edge first, or digging down one side and then across. But every pit is different. The danger is always present. The walls might give way. The bottom could be thinner than it looks. Once, a gong farmer in Southwark was buried alive when a pit collapsed, his shouts muffled by 3 centuries of rot. Above, the team works as quietly as possible. The buckets are hauled up on ropes, hand over hand, the contents dumped into larger tubs lined with rough linen. These tubs are loaded onto heavy carts, the wheels muffled with straw to keep the noise from drawing too much attention. The carts themselves are ancient, battered things, marked with stains and patched with whatever wood is available. No one wants a new cart for this job. Everything about the work is second-hand, worn in, and anonymous. Outside, the city is a world away. The gong farmer's night is spent mostly in shadows, the route planned to avoid the homes of the wealthy or the routes of the watch. Even the dogs sense something is different and slink away, tails down. The night air is cooler than the pits, but no less oppressive. If it's winter, your breath hangs in the air, each exhale mingling with the clouds of stink trailing from the carts. In summer, the air is thick and close, every window tightly shuttered in the hope of keeping the worst of the night outside. Sometimes, as they move through the lanes, the farmers encounter each other, one team finishing a job just as another arrives. There are quick exchanges, warnings about bad gas, a pit that nearly caved in, a spot where the road has washed out. These brief moments are the only real social contact they get all night. The city is full of ghosts at this hour, but only the farmers move with purpose. Dangers multiply after midnight. The later the hour, the more unpredictable the work becomes. Drunks wander home from the alehouse, sometimes stumbling into the path of the carts. Watchmen, half asleep, might demand to know what's being moved, always hoping for something more valuable than what the gong farmers have to offer. Fights break out in the darkness, not over money or pride, but over who gets to avoid the worst jobs. The bravest, or perhaps the most foolhardy, are sent to clear the oldest pits, the ones rumoured to be haunted or, worse, infested with rats as big as dogs. Each night brings its own hazards. The farmers must watch for broken boards and sharp nails, for sudden drops and slippery stone. Rain makes the work doubly dangerous, turning the ground to mud and hiding holes that could swallow a cart whole. In winter, ice forms on every surface, slick as glass. The lucky slip and only bruise themselves. The unlucky fall, buckets upended, and must start all over again. But perhaps the greatest danger is exhaustion. The work is punishing. Muscle and sweat and endless repetition. Gong farmers sleep in snatches, if at all, curling up on straw mats in rooms that smell almost as bad as the pits. Some chew willow bark to dull the aches. Others drink strong ale before starting the shift, hoping to numb their senses before they descend. Everyone knows someone who's died on the job or come close. By the time the eastern sky begins to pale, the city is stirring. Cocks crow, dogs bark, the first bakeries open their shutters. The farmers hurry to finish, hauling the last carts out of town toward the dumping grounds, those fields beyond the walls where the night's work is finally laid to rest. There's a mad scramble to scrub the worst of the filth from their hands, faces, boots. Some, too tired to bother, simply pull their cloaks tighter and slip home through the side streets, hoping to avoid the stares and muttered insults that follow them by day. If the night streets of a medieval city were strange and shadowed, the world beneath them was something else entirely. A domain where no sunlight ever reached, where every sense was assaulted, and all the rules of above-ground life seemed to break down. In the daylight, a city might be full of bustling crowds, horse carts, stray dogs, and chattering children. But in the pits, in that thick, airless dark, there was nothing but mud, madness, and the ceaseless, indifferent labour of the men who called it their workplace. To step down into a cesspit is to enter another reality. It begins with the first, tentative foot lowering off the ladder, seeking out purchase in the soft, unsteady ground below. Above, the flicker of a lantern casts a trembling circle of light, and for a moment you imagine, foolishly, that you'll be able to see what you're getting into. The truth is you never do. The bottom of the pit is chaos, a slow, seething slurry of everything people want to forget, layered year upon year, with its own logic, its own threats, its own unpredictable surprises. The air in a medieval cesspit is not merely foul, it's hazardous in ways that science was only beginning to hint at, and in ways that even the bravest of farmers learn to respect, or else. Each pit is a chemical stew, releasing invisible, odorless killers with every new disturbance. Methane seeps up from the rot below, gathering in silent, explosive pockets, while ammonia, and hydrogen sulfide ride in on every shovel stroke, stinging the eyes, burning the lungs, making the head swim. There are stories, half whispered, half believed, of farmers dropping dead before they even begun the real work, as if struck down by some vengeful spirit of the pit. It was not a superstition, though the language of toxic gas was absent from most men's vocabularies. The dangers were real and deadly. Not all hazards are invisible. The rats were a constant, nervy presence, always hungry, always bold. Fat and fierce, they skittered along ledges and dropped down from cracks. Sometimes so numerous, they formed a moving carpet atop the filth. They would bite if cornered, and sometimes in the dark, a farmer would feel a sudden, sharp nip at his boot, or worse, at his fingers as he groped for a tool. It was not unknown for men to come out of a pit with a new set of scars, or, if luck truly turned sour, a fever that no apothecary could cure. Then there were the physical dangers of the pits themselves. Some were old and crumbling, their brickwork slick with years of seepage, their wooden beams half rotted by moisture and neglect. The floor might give way with little warning, sending a man plunging into depths he hadn't bargained for. A poorly built cesspit could collapse, smothering the unlucky soul beneath tons of muck and rubble, his shouts muffled by a world that swallowed sound as greedily as it swallowed light. Sometimes these disasters became city gossip. Did you hear about that poor fellow at livery yard? And for a few days, people might even utter thanks that their own pit was still intact, still someone else's problem. No two cesspits were quite the same. In wealthier neighborhoods, the pits might be deep and well lined, a legacy of careful planning and a sign of just how much filth money could buy. In the poorer quarters, pits were often shallow, barely more than a hole beneath the floor, their edges bleeding out into the clay, contaminating wells and foundations with grim efficiency. Some households, desperate to save a few pennies, would toss everything down the pit. Kitchen scraps, dead animals, broken crockery, rags, and the occasional mystery item, best left unidentified. Every farmer had his own catalogue of strange finds. An entire piglet once, bones still pink beneath the grime. A cache of stolen jewellery tossed in to hide the evidence, never retrieved. A dead cat curled like a shadow. A sack of chicken heads thrown in after a particularly enthusiastic market day. Sometimes, even the oddest finds were explained with a shrug. In the world of a pit, nothing stayed surprising for long. Every job brought its own grim rhythm. The farmer would shovel, his muscles burning with the weight and resistance of muck so thick it seemed to fight back. A substance not quite liquid and not quite solid, always on the verge of overwhelming. The bucket would be filled, hauled up on the rope, emptied, lowered again. Each repetition brought new waves of fumes. Each shovel struck a chance for the wall to crumble, for a rat to bolt past, for the body to rebel. Sweat mingled with filth until it was impossible to know what belonged to the body and what to the pit. The psychological grind was as punishing as the physical labour. Down here in the belly of the city, all the rules of the polite society disappeared. No one cared about class or kin, about the latest sumptuary law, or the preacher's warning on gluttony. In the pit, everyone was equal, reduced to the same basic, animal struggle to get through the shift alive, and if possible, with a little dignity intact. Conversation was limited. A muttered curse, a nervous joke, a shouted warning when something went wrong. Mostly, there was only the sound of breathing, laboured and harsh, and the endless splash of filth against wood and brick. Sometimes, strange hallucinations would drift up out of the darkness, a flicker of movement caught at the corner of the eye, a shape that seemed to shift and writhe as if the pit itself were alive. Fatigue and fumes did things to the mind, blurring the boundaries between real and imagined dangers. Stories grew up among the farmers about ghosts and spirits, curses and omens, the souls of the forgotten dead trapped in the muck, waiting for someone to stumble into their grasp. Some men tied charms to their belts or scratched protective signs onto their shovels. Others relied on nothing but stubbornness and the cold comfort of a shared joke. Illness was an ever-present risk. Even with careful washing, such as it was, most farmers carried the marks of their trade. Persistent coughs, open sores that never quite healed, fevers that flared up without warning, aches in the bones that settled deep and permanent. Some said you could always spot a gong farmer by the redness of his eyes and the yellow tinge to his nails, the skin of his hands permanently wrinkled from long nights in the wet. Death could come quickly. A misstep, a gasp of foul air, a rat's bite gone septic, or it could creep in slowly, year by year, until the farmer simply failed to wake one morning, the city barely noticing his absence. Yet despite all this, there was a kind of pride among the men who survived the pits. They knew themselves to be tougher than most, immune to the soft complaints of those who flinched at a little dirt or stench. There was a camaraderie born of shared hardship, a black humour that could turn even the worst disaster into a story for the ages. On the rare night when a shift went well, when the walls held, the gas was thin, the hole was light, and no one lost a boot or worse, there might even be a song sung on the way home, a defiant declaration that the city could throw its worst at them, and they would still endure. The pit was a world with its own time, its own geography, its own rituals of survival. It was a place where nothing stayed clean, where the border between man and muck was thin as skin. In the morning, when the first light crept over the city and the streets above came to life, the gong farmers would blink at the sun and wonder how it was possible that the rest of the world could go on, oblivious atop foundations built on the night's labour. Their work was already forgotten, wiped away like a bad dream, replaced by the ordinary sounds of haggling, laughter, and the ring of a blacksmith's hammer. So the pit is empty. The last bucket has been hauled up. The air is swirling with a slightly less deadly perfume, and the gong farmer wipes his brow, leaving a dark streak behind. The family upstairs breathes a little easier, the household once again secure from the rising tide below. But the story of the city's waste doesn't end at the edge of the pit. In many ways, that is where it truly begins. Because all that filth, all that evidence of lives lived and meals digested, has to go somewhere. The medieval world, for all its efforts to ignore the process, was built on an endless, secret migration of muck. Picture the city just before dawn, streets still slick from the night's labours, a heavy cart creaking its way through the half-light. The gong farmers work in pairs, or small groups now, their movements practiced and spare. They keep their heads down as they trundle heavy tubs through lanes barely wide enough for a man and a dog to pass, let alone a wagon loaded with the product of 100 households. The iron-banded wheels bump and judder over cobbles, the contents slopping gently with each turn. Where is all the waste going? The answer depends on geography, on law, and on the improvisational spirit that governs every city's dirty secrets. In London, there were official dumping grounds, parcels of land outside the city's walls, usually east or south, chosen for their distance from the wealthy and the well-born. These places had names that rarely appeared on any map, whispered only when necessary: Laystall, Dung Hill, Marshalsea Fields. Here, night after night, the city's underworld was spread out for the crows and the worms to pick over, heaps that steamed and bubbled in the morning sun, sending up a miasma that announced itself a mile away. Sometimes the path out of town was a gauntlet. The city's gates were manned even at night, and not every guard was happy to wave through a wagon piled high with sewage. There were tolls to pay, or bribes slipped into a calloused hand, or just a sullen mutter and a look the other way. Occasionally, a load too full or a cart too rickety would collapse en route, disgorging its cargo at the very heart of town and prompting a scramble to clean up before the morning market began. For the unlucky householders along these routes, the night could bring a rude surprise. A river of filth flowing past the door, a pungent reminder that the work of civilization was never done. But if city law was clear, human ingenuity was always a step ahead. Not all waste made it to the official grounds. Some farmers, pressed for time or coin, would tip their buckets in the nearest open gutter, or down a disused alleyway, or over a fence into an abandoned lot. The city's ditches and streams became secret tributaries of this endless brown tide, carrying the evidence of last night's feast to the river, or worse, to a neighbor's well. Complaints were made, fines threatened, but enforcement was difficult when the work happened under the cover of darkness, and the offenders vanished before sunrise. Yet even this was only one part of the story. The truth is, very little in the medieval world was wasted for long. What began as an unwanted burden beneath a city street could become, by twists and turns, something precious. For outside the city, in the fields and gardens that fed its teeming masses, waste was not simply discarded, it was transformed. The night soil, as it came to be called, was spread over crops and orchards as fertilizer. Farmers, as pragmatic as they were hungry, understood that what the city threw away could, with patience and sun and rain, be made to feed the city once again. The process had its own rituals. Cartloads of waste were dumped in great heaps at the edges of fields, allowed to rot down in the open air, the heat baking away some of the worst pathogens and leaving a rich, deep compost. In the spring, this muck was spread with wide, careless sweeps, mixed into the soil with wooden rakes and spades. Wheat and barley, beans and onions, cabbages and apples all owed a debt to the city's leavings. Every loaf of bread, every bowl of stew carried the faint, invisible signature of the work done in darkness months before. It was a cycle that bound city and countryside together more intimately than any trade or festival. The food eaten at supper might one day return as the stench beneath the floorboards. The waste carried out by a gong farmer in January might blossom as new peas in June. No one talked about it, not really, but everyone knew. There was a dark kind of poetry in it, the knowledge that nothing was ever truly lost, that the city's filth was, in the end, the source of its survival. Of course, not all fields were created equal. The richest land was that closest to the city's walls, the first to receive the annual offering of compost and dung. Farmers farther out, who had to rely on animal manure, or whatever the wind might bring, grumbled at the unfairness of it all. In lean years, fights broke out over access to the best heaps and the right to cart away the freshest, least decayed muck. There were even contracts, written or unwritten, between city officials and landowners, deals struck in taverns over muddy jugs of ale, promising the knight's haul in exchange for a share of the harvest. Sometimes the path from pit to plate was more direct than anyone liked to admit. Riverbanks where waste was dumped became prime spots for wild greens and herbs. Children foraged there in the spring, bringing home armfuls of sorrel and cress. The fish in the Thames and the Fleet feasted on the city's refuse, growing fat and, some said, developing a flavour all their own. London salmon, the joke went, tastes of the city. Not everyone laughed. Even the dead played a role. Burials were often shallow, and heavy rains or careless digging could send the bones of old Londoners mingling with the city's nightly offerings. It was not unheard of for a farmer to unearth a skull while turning the heap to find a jawbone grinning up through the compost. Some took it as an omen, a reminder of mortality. Others just tossed the bone aside and kept working. Life in the medieval world was always close to its own ending. Beyond the city, the dumping grounds became their own strange landscape. Hills rising where none should be, valleys filling in over generations, marshes thick with reeds and the chorus of frogs. The smell carried for miles, a warning and a promise, drawing in gulls and crows, wild dogs, and the desperate poor. Scavengers combed the heaps by day, looking for scraps of cloth, bits of wood, anything that might be salvaged. Children played at the edges, daring each other to go closer, to prod the piles with sticks, to see what secrets the night had left behind. Not all who lived near the dumps saw them as a curse. Some found a strange pride in it, the idea that the city's very existence depended on this uneasy exchange. The fields fed the city fed the fields, and in between, a handful of men moved through the darkness, their labours as old as civilization itself. For the gong farmer, the journey didn't end with the dumping. There was always more to do. Tools to clean, carts to scrub, hands to wash in whatever water could be spared. The smell lingered, stubborn and thick, clinging to hair and skin no matter how much scrubbing was done. Sometimes, after a long night, a farmer would pause on his walk home, standing at the edge of a field just as the sun broke the horizon, and watch as the mist rose from the fresh ploughed ground. He might see for a moment the city behind him, roofs and spires and chimneys, and know with a quiet satisfaction that he had played a part in keeping it alive. And when the first green shoots poked up through the muck, when the market stalls overflowed with carrots and leeks and peas, the connection between waste and sustenance became, if not celebrated, at least understood. The medieval world was a place of cycles, life and death, growth and decay, feast and famine. The work of the night vanished with the dawn, but it returned unbidden, on every plate and in every breath. If a gong farmer's life was defined by the darkness of their work, it was shaped just as powerfully by the attitudes of the world above. To the city at large, the gong farmer was an uneasy paradox, indispensable yet unwelcome, both the saviour who kept catastrophe at bay and the walking embodiment of everything civilization was desperate to ignore. The social position of the waste collector was like the shadow at the heart of medieval society, a reminder that, no matter how many layers of tapestry or candle smoke a household amassed, the lowest part of human existence was never far away. On the rare occasion when a gong farmer ventured out by daylight, he moved like someone accustomed to being unseen. Even children, who usually delighted in the outlandish or the forbidden, kept their distance, half out of fear, half out of a learned suspicion, as if merely catching the man's eye might invite a whiff of something unspeakable into your own home. There was a deeply ingrained etiquette for avoiding the man with the bucket. Neighbours would look away, crossing to the opposite side of the lane. Shopkeepers might shuffle their wares out of reach, and innkeepers, however desperate for coin, would find sudden reason to busy themselves at the far end of the counter. In a society obsessed with order, rank, and the visible signs of status, the gong farmer was a living contradiction. Legally, he was a free man. Many were born and bred in the city, with families, church ties, and the right to marry, own property, and, on paper at least, vote in the rare matters allowed to the commoner. But in practice, the gong farmer lived at the margins of civic life, somewhere between the tolerated and the untouchable. If the leper was physically set apart for fear of disease, the gong farmer was kept at arm's length by a force even stronger: disgust. The disgust was not just personal, it was codified into law, ritual, and custom. Cities passed ordinances regulating when and where the gong farmers could move, what routes they could use, and even the hours they might appear in public. In London, the work was strictly a nocturnal affair, not simply for convenience, but to keep the sight and smell of the process from offending persons of quality. Certain lanes were reserved for their carts, and they could be fined for appearing on major thoroughfares outside of curfew. There were even reports of gong farmer badges or permits, both as proof of occupation and as a warning to others of their approach. Even the language people used to describe the profession was layered with avoidance and euphemism. The word gong itself was kind of a verbal fig leaf, just as night soil cloaked its meaning in a shroud of poetry. When people did have to speak directly about the work, it was always with a nervous titter, a half-joking, half-appalled air, as if naming the thing too plainly would somehow invite it into the parlour. Yet for all this, there was a grudging recognition of necessity. When a household cesspit overflowed, when the stench crept up through the floorboards and rats made their presence known, the farmer was summoned in haste and paid without quibbling. In those moments, class barriers evaporated. Everyone, from the wealthiest merchant to the poorest widow, was equally vulnerable to the elemental force of human waste. Some households even kept a private stash of coins hidden away for this very purpose, a silent admission that the need would always return. There were stories, passed from mother to child, of what happened to those who spurned the farmer's help. The neighbour who refused to pay and woke one night to find the contents of the pit dumped across the doorstep. The baker who mocked a farmer's smell, only to have his own basement flood with sewage the following week. These tales, half cautionary, half revenge fantasy, gave the gong farmer a strange power a mixture of fear and respect, the kind reserved for those who traffic in the city's deepest secrets. Still, the sense of social distance was overwhelming. In church, a gong farmer might stand at the very back, near the door, or slip in late and leave before the final hymn. Their families too bore the burden. Children teased at school, wives avoided at the market, a kind of invisible barrier, always in place. Even in death the stigma lingered. There are records of burial grounds set aside for the lowest trades, as if the city feared its own filth might rise again if not properly contained. All this created a peculiar form of invisibility. The farmers walked the city, worked its very foundations, yet remained unknown, unnamed, unmentioned in polite conversation. Their homes were often clustered together on the edge of town, downwind if possible, close to the dumps or marshes that received the night's haul. In these neighborhoods, the sense of community was different, tougher, more insular, bound by a common understanding of hardship and the world's reluctance to look them in the eye. Within this closed circle, there developed a kind of grim pride, a sense of being in on the city's greatest secret, of knowing that while everyone else pretended cleanliness, they alone kept disaster at bay. Farmers told jokes that would have horrified their betters, shared tricks for scrubbing the worst stains from skin and soul, and passed down knowledge from father to son, how to spot a pit about to collapse, when to leave a job unfinished, who to trust with a share of the night's wages. There were too the small acts of kindness, neighbours who shared a jug of ale at the end of a long shift, a wife who set a clean shirt by the door, a child who ran ahead to open the gate before dawn. Against the city's disdain, these gestures mattered all the more, tokens of normal life in a world that refused to grant them. Society may have tried to keep the gong farmer out of sight, but it never quite succeeded in keeping him out of mind. If disaster struck, if a plague swept through, or the river rose and flooded the low districts, suddenly the city remembered the men who understood the lay of its filth-choked arteries. In these rare moments, the gong farmer was sought out as an expert, a guide through the maze of waste and water. The same merchants who once pinched their noses now listened to his advice, if only until the danger passed. The truth, unspoken but ever present, was that the city needed its outcasts just as much as its lords and priests. Every layer of medieval life rested, in the end, on the silent, tireless labour of those it pretended not to see. The greater the distance society tried to put between itself and its waste, the more powerful the farmer's shadow became. It would be easy, at first glance, to imagine the gong farmer's life as an endless trial, a punishment disguised as employment, a role so foul that its only reward was to finish each night still breathing. Yet reality, as always, was more complicated. In the strange, upside-down economy of medieval cities, the worst job often came with the best pay, and the men shunned by polite society sometimes found opportunities unavailable to all but the boldest or most desperate. In the shadow of the city, the gong farmer discovered his own peculiar upsides. Start with the matter of money. For all the scorn heaped upon the profession, the wages were nothing to sneer at. While the average labourer might earn a meagre handful of coins in a week, barely enough to keep a family in bread and onions, the gong farmer could, on a good night, double or even triple that sum. The city's upper classes, for all their airs, paid handsomely to keep their homes sweet-smelling and their foundations intact. There were stories, half whispered and half envied, of men who started with nothing but a borrowed shovel and after a decade's work in the pits, managed to buy a house, a plot of land, or even a small tavern on the edge of town, some place where the clientele didn't mind a lingering whiff of adventure. In some cities, the gong farmers organized themselves into loose guilds or companies, pooling resources to purchase better equipment or bribe city officials when trouble arose. There were routes to be negotiated, contracts to be won, alliances to be formed. The most ambitious could rise to manage a whole crew of nightmen, taking a cut from every pit cleared within a certain district. It wasn't unheard of for a clever operator to build a small empire out of muck, employing his relatives and neighbors, ensuring steady work and a shared prosperity. There were, too, the odd windfalls. Medieval people threw everything down the privy. Lost rings, dropped coins, discarded jewelry, secret letters, even the odd purse snatched in a market brawl and flung down the hole to avoid detection. Over time, a farmer with a sharp eye and a quick hand might fish up enough valuables to rival the proceeds from an entire season's labor. There are tales, some no doubt embellished, of men who stumbled on a forgotten hoard and vanished into legend, trading bucket and shovel for fine clothes and a new name in a distant town. But perhaps the greatest, if least visible advantage, was a kind of independence. In a society where most lives were defined by deference to lord, guild, master, priest, the gong farmer answered to almost no one. The work was grim, but it was his. No bailiff hovered over his shoulder, no steward docked his pay for tardiness. The night was his domain, the schedule his to keep. If he chose to sleep past noon or take a day off in the market, there was little anyone could say. In a world obsessed with hierarchy, the man at the very bottom enjoyed a peculiar freedom, one paid for, of course, in sweat and solitude. There was also, against all odds, a certain pride in the work. Not the pride of a stonemason admiring a new wall, or a baker pulling golden loaves from the oven, but something grimmer and more private. To survive in the pits was proof of strength, cunning, resilience. Newcomers, green-faced and gagging, rarely lasted more than a week. Only those with iron nerves and a knack for problem-solving made it through a season. Veterans of the trade traded stories of the night a pit flooded and a man held his breath longer than anyone thought possible, of the time a collapsing wall was braced at the last moment by quick thinking and quicker hands. The city might look away, but within the tight circle of the trade, feats of endurance and daring were remembered and respected. Occasionally, the barriers of class and disgust could even be breached, if only for a moment. In times of crisis, when a wealthy merchant's house was threatened by a sudden flood, or a lord's cellar backed up with a force that stumped all the household servants, the gong farmer became, however briefly, the most important man in town. He was summoned with haste, treated with anxious courtesy, promised generous rewards if only he could work his grim magic and restore the household to order. Some men learned to bargain in these moments, extracting higher fees, a hot meal, or even the promise of steady work for relatives in need. For a handful of exceptional farmers, the work became a stepping stone. City records tell of men who parlayed their earnings into a change of fortune, moving from waste to property, from midnight to daylight. One might invest in a partnership with a brewer, using his earnings to buy a share in the alehouse trade. Another might buy a small plot of land just beyond the city walls, turning a dumping ground into a thriving vegetable patch and selling produce back to the very neighborhoods he once cleared of filth. In these rare cases, the arc of a life could bend upward, the shame of the pits replaced, if not by honor, then at least by self-sufficiency. Even the social stigma, though real, was not always a prison. Among their own, the gong farmers formed close bonds, networks of support, camaraderie, and shared survival. Within these tight-knit circles, gossip and laughter flowed more freely, troubles were halved, and successes celebrated. Children of the trade grew up tough and resourceful, sometimes moving on to other lines of work, with a resilience their neighbors envied. In the anonymous dark, with only the lantern's glow for company, a man could dream his own dreams, untroubled by the judgments of the world above. For some, there was a strange kind of romance in the life. The city, in the hours before dawn, belonged to the gong farmer alone, a secret kingdom of empty lanes and silent houses, of mist rising from the river, and stars caught in black puddles between the cobbles. Here was a world apart from the jostling crowds and the endless noise, a place where a man's thoughts could wander as freely as his feet. If the work was filthy, it was also, in its own way, a ticket to solitude, a measure of peace that few others could claim. Of course, the upsides were not for everyone, and many who took up the shovel did so only because there was nowhere else to go. But for those who learned the rhythms, mastered the dangers, and outlasted the worst of what the city could throw at them, the life of a gong farmer offered something rare, the chance to carve out a place of their own in a world that offered little charity to the poor, the odd, or the unlucky. And so, night after night, they labored on, sometimes grumbling, sometimes laughing, sometimes counting the coins that piled up, however slowly, in a wooden box beneath the bed. Above them the city dreamed, ignorant or willfully blind to the lives that made its own possible. Below, in the shadowed lanes and the secret world of the pits, the gong farmer took his own kind of satisfaction from the work, a dirty, difficult, and unlovely trade, but one that, for the right kind of man, could bring not just survival, but something dangerously close to freedom. The gong farmer, as we imagine him, clad in battered leather, eyes red from the lantern's glare, trundling through midnight London with a cart full of unspeakable cargo, was not alone in history. Across centuries and continents, every city that dreamed of greatness also had to reckon with the simple, unglamorous reality of human waste. Yet while the need was universal, the answers were endlessly inventive, shaped by landscape, technology, custom, and necessity. Begin with the medieval Englishman's continental cousins. In Paris, the task fell to the vidangeur, the night soil man of the City of Light, though his nights were as dark and perilous as any in London. Parisian privies were often deeper and even more crowded, built beneath the great tenements of the Marais or the winding alleys of the left bank. The French had their own rhythms. Waste was collected by torchlight and carried out in barrels. The men navigating streets that were sometimes even narrower and more dangerous than those in England. Vidangeurs became notorious for their brawny strength and thick-soled boots, and in the worst months, the stench rising from the Seine and the city's countless cesspools was said to rival any in Europe. Paris too developed elaborate rules, timed permits, city-issued lanterns, contracts with landowners on the city's fringes. If the English looked down on their gong farmers, the Parisians were hardly more charitable to their own. but the sense of grim necessity echoed across the channel. Travel further back to ancient Rome, a city famed for its aqueducts, public baths, and extraordinary engineering, yet always just a few steps ahead of disaster when it came to sanitation. The Romans built an entire empire of drains and sewers, the most famous being the Cloaca Maxima, a vast underground channel that still runs beneath the city today. Yet the sewers did not clean themselves. The dirty, dangerous labor fell to slaves and low-status workers, foricari, who braved darkness, disease, and the risk of being swept away by sudden floods. Roman law prescribed careful maintenance, but, as in every era, corners were cut. Complaints about foul odors and blocked drains appear in ancient graffiti and official records alike. Even emperors had to issue edicts, reminding the city that Rome was only as glorious as its cleanest gutter. The story was different again in cities of China. Here, the practice of collecting and recycling night soil evolved into an almost artful science, and the work, while far from esteemed, could, at times, offer a strange sort of prestige. Chinese farmers prized human waste as fertilizer, and the job of the night soil collector often passed from father to son for generations. Unlike their European counterparts, Chinese collectors sometimes wore distinctive black or blue uniforms and traveled well-trodden routes through the city, collecting pails of waste from urban households and delivering them directly to nearby fields. The work was still hard, still isolating, but it was so deeply woven into the urban-rural economy that by the 19th and even 20th centuries, it was seen as essential, even honorable, in a pragmatic way. In some regions, collectors banded together in powerful associations, negotiating prices and routes with both city officials and country farmers. The Chinese night soil trade, with its networks and organization, was so efficient that it attracted the admiration and occasional envy of Western observers well into the modern age. In the Ottoman Empire, cities like Istanbul had their own cadre of waste men, often drawn from the ranks of the marginalized. Some cities used convicts sentenced to hard labor to keep the streets and privies clean, turning punishment into utility. Elsewhere, professional cleaners operated on a system of municipal contracts, their services quietly valued by pashas and street vendors alike. In Japan, too, night soil was once a valuable commodity, especially in the dense cities of Edo and Osaka. There, waste was so coveted by rice farmers that landowners sometimes paid tenants for the right to collect what was left behind. The work was still shunned by many, but in a society that prized order and efficiency, even the most unpleasant tasks could take on an unexpected dignity. Yet not every society found peace with its waste. In pre-industrial Russia, the cities often lagged far behind their Western counterparts. Streets and alleys became clogged with refuse, and the unfortunate few assigned to remove it worked in conditions so appalling that they left almost no record at all. In colonial America, the necessary men labored by night, sometimes slaves or indentured servants, their work hidden away, even as it kept the New World's ambitions afloat. In the growing cities of South Asia and the Middle East, the work fell to the lowest castes or outcast communities, groups whose very identity was bound up with the handling of dirt, sometimes for centuries at a time. What emerges from this tangle of histories is not just a chronicle of filth, but a testament to human adaptability. Each city, each age found its own answer, some temporary, some ingeniously permanent. With the rise of industrial plumbing, steam engines, and the anonymous armies of municipal workers, the gong farmers' kind began to vanish from view, replaced by pipes, pumps, and citywide sanitation systems. But even here, the past left its mark. The first great sewers of Victorian London were built in response to public horror at the Great Stink of 1858, when summer heat and overflowing cesspits bore the city to its knees. The engineers who designed these marvels of brick and stone were often inspired by the trials and improvisations of the night soil men who came before. Yet in many parts of the world, the old ways persisted. Even into the 20th century, Chinese and Japanese cities maintained thriving night soil economies, and in the sprawling urban jungles of today's developing world, millions still labor in the shadows, their work as thankless and vital as that of any gong farmer in medieval London. The names have changed, the tools have improved, but the essential truth remains. Civilization is built on a foundation of invisible labor, carried out by those willing or forced to do what others will not. And so, the story of the gong farmer stretches from Rome to Shanghai, from the alleys of Paris to the backwaters of Edo, each culture reshaping the work in its own image, each society finding, in filth, a mirror for its deepest hopes and fears. For all our advances, the question that haunted the first city dweller lingers still. What do we do with what we cannot bear to face? The answer, as always, are written in darkness, carried away one bucket at a time. For centuries, the nightly trek of the gong farmer through sleepless cities seemed as eternal as the rising of the sun. The pit would fill, the bucket would empty, and the cycle would begin again. Yet the world, as it always does, changed. First slowly, with whispers and experiments, and then all at once, sweeping the old ways aside with astonishing speed. The first cracks in the gong farmer's dominion came from above, from scholars, inventors, and reformers who began to ask, for the first time in history, whether civilization truly had to coexist with such visible filth. The Renaissance, for all its splendor in art and learning, produced its share of practical minds obsessed with the mechanics of waste. Early versions of the flushing toilet appeared in noble houses as early as the late 16th century, courtesy of English courtiers like Sir John Harrington, whose invention was as much a curiosity as a convenience. Most people still preferred chamber pots or simple pits, but the seed was planted. What if waste could be made to vanish, never handled by human hands at all? The 18th and 19th centuries brought a new spirit of public order. Urban populations exploded, driven by industry, commerce, and a hunger for better lives. Cities grew, but their infrastructure struggled to keep pace. By now, the old cesspits were not just an inconvenience, they were a crisis. Overflows became routine. The stench seeped through even the thickest city walls. Rivers and wells teemed with invisible threats. In London, Paris, and New York alike, epidemics swept through neighborhoods where waste found its way into the water, taking lives by the thousand. The cholera outbreaks of the 1830s and 1850s in particular forced a reckoning. Death was no longer a private matter, it became a civic emergency. It was around this time that the work of the gong farmer began to change. In some places, the profession was gradually swallowed by the rise of municipal authorities. City councils hired more men, bought more carts, and attempted to regulate the process with new vigor. Yet even these improvements couldn't keep up. As one city inspector famously remarked in Victorian London, "We are fighting a rising tide with teaspoons." Then in a moment as drastic as any in city's history came the true revolution, the modern sewer. In London, the Great Stink of 1858, when the Thames itself turned into a river of filth so overflowing that Parliament nearly fled Westminster, became the catalyst for a transformation. Engineers like Joseph Bazalgette designed vast, subterranean tunnels that carried waste from the heart of the city and out to distant treatment fields. Pipes replaced pails, and the very geography of filth shifted from the visible to the invisible. Cities across Europe and North America raced to build their own sewer networks, each a marvel of engineering and a death sentence for the old way of life. Flushing toilets followed, first as a luxury, then as a necessity. By the late 19th century, the average urban home was connected to a growing network of pipes, traps, and water closets. The once essential skills of the gong farmer, ropes, shovels, the knowledge of which pits would flood or cave, grew obsolete. Young men sought other work. The companies and guilds that had ruled the night either adapted, became city contractors, or vanished. The world had turned. But the transition was not instant, nor was it gentle. For many, especially the poor or those in rural areas, the bucket and the pit remained stubborn realities well into the 20th century. In some towns, honey wagons still rattled down back lanes, collecting waste from households not yet reached by the miracle of modern plumbing. The memory of old ways lingered in city bylaws, in jokes told at the expense of the night soil men, and in the stubborn fear of what might happen if the pipes ever failed. What was lost, along with the profession, was a certain intimacy with the underworld of the city, a familiarity with its darkest corners, its vulnerabilities, and its cycle of decay and renewal. The new sewers were triumphs of progress, but they made the reality of waste a distant abstraction. For the first time in history, most people could truly forget what happened after they went. The dirt was hidden, the labor out of sight. Gratitude, if it existed at all, shifted to the engineers and plumbers, and the memory of men who kept the city clean with their own hands faded into a curious footnote. And yet, the story is not quite over. In every great city, armies of sanitation workers still labor by night, clearing blockages, maintaining pipes, dealing with the problems that even the best technology cannot solve. In the developing world, the cycle persists, and the ancient profession survives in an altered form, carried on by men and women who still know the city's secrets, who still walk home at dawn with the scent of the night clinging to their clothes. If there is a story hidden behind the filth, it is a story of the mind, what it took, night after night, for a human being to stare down the city's worst, to descend willingly into the pits, and to return, battered but unbroken, to the world above. The psychology of the gong farmer, his inner armor and vulnerabilities, may be the least documented part of his life, but it is no less important than the carts and ropes and wages. Here in the quiet spaces between shifts, we glimpse the deeper resilience that allowed these men to endure what most could not imagine. To become a gong farmer was to cross an invisible threshold. On one side stood the ordinary world, with its expectations, ambitions and rules. On the other, a shadowed kingdom, where those rules meant little. The first time a man descended into a cesspit, there was no mistaking the transformation. The senses rebelled. The eyes stung from fumes. The skin crawled. The stomach heaved. For many, it was a test they failed. The mind simply refused to accept the world as it was in the dark. But for those who stayed, there came a strange hardening. The body adjusted. The mind learned new tricks for survival. One was the art of detachment. Gong farmers, veteran and novice alike, learned to keep part of themselves elsewhere while they worked. A fragment of thought, a silent tune, a memory of sunlight on the river, or a child's laughter at home. This compartmentalization was as vital as any tool, allowing a man to move through muck and danger without letting it touch the deepest parts of himself. Some described it, in later years, as becoming a ghost in your own skin, present and alert, but always half dreaming of another place. There was also a grim sense of humor, forged in adversity and shared among the brotherhood of the night. When the world above recoiled in horror or disgust, the gong farmers answered with laughter. Jokes about whose boots would never be clean again. Tall tales about the biggest rat or the worst collapse. Elaborate bets on what strange thing would turn up next in a pit. This humor was never pretty, but it was fiercely effective. A bulwark against despair. A way to remind each other that they were, in the end, still human. Survival was as much about community as it was about individual grit. The bonds formed in the dark were strong, a sense of mutual reliance and unspoken trust. When a new man joined the crew, he was watched closely, not for skill alone but for spirit. Would he panic when the air turned foul? Would he freeze up at the sight of bones or writhing rats? Those who endured earned the respect of their fellows, and sometimes the grudging respect of other outcasts, tanners, butchers, gravediggers, who understood what it meant to live on society's edge. But the burden was not only physical or social. The work left its marks on the mind, the dreams that returned unbidden, the nights spent awake, even after the shift was done, the sense of being forever marked by something invisible. Some farmers describe the feeling as a permanent otherness, never quite able to rejoin the ordinary world, always seeing the city through the veil of secrets. There was, too, the knowledge that every day above ground could be the last. The job was perilous. One breath of poison gas, one slip in the dark, one unnoticed wound could end a life with no fanfare. This knowledge bred a kind of fatalism, an acceptance of risk that became part of the daily rhythm, like the clatter of buckets or the scrape of shovel on stone. Yet even as the work isolated, it also created strange islands of pride and purpose. For some, the knowledge that their work held off disaster, that their hands kept plague and ruin at bay, was a quiet source of meaning. They did not expect thanks from above, but among their own, a well-told story, a shared cup of ale, or even just a silent nod at the end of a long night could be enough. Coping with stigma demanded its own tactics. Some men became invisible by choice, slipping through the city's lanes with eyes averted, never lingering where they were not welcome. Others embraced their differences, meeting scorn with defiant stare or a ready jest. Wives and children learned to live with the whispers, the looks, and the long stretches of absence, drawing strength from the tight-knit circles of family and trade. There were rituals of cleansing, both practical and symbolic. After each shift, a farmer might scrub his hands and face with vinegar or lye, trying to erase the night's work as best he could. Some men kept a clean shirt hidden away, to be worn only at church or on festival days, a fragile armor against the world's memory. A few, on the rare occasions when fortune allowed, left the trade altogether, carrying with them an unspoken legacy of endurance and adaptability into whatever new life they built. And always there was hope, fragile, battered, but stubborn. Hope that the next pit would be shallower, that the next pay would last a little longer, that the next generation might find a way out. In this way, the gong farmer's psychology was not just a matter of surviving the night, but of dreaming, against all odds, of something better. Imagine the city as dawn breaks, a place waking gently, golden light glancing off windows, the market stalls shivering open, the first carts rolling down streets, washed clean by the invisible labours of the night. Few stop to wonder how this order is possible, how the great machine of city life hums along without choking on its own mess. In these quiet, hopeful hours, the world above rarely remembers the world below. And yet, for centuries, it was the people under the city, the silent legion of gong farmers, who kept the gears from grinding to a halt. They moved unseen, but their impact was everywhere. In the sweetness of the air, in the freshness of the well, in the fact that the city itself could endure through heat, food, and plague. Each dawn their work was erased, the evidence of the night tucked away in distant fields, the risk and the squalor dissolved in the sun's first rays. History does not much remember these men. They left few names, fewer records. No statues honor their labor. No chronicles celebrate their nightly victories. If they appear at all in the city's memory, it is as a footnote, a joke, a caution, a grim curiosity. But scratch the surface of any great metropolis, and you find their fingerprints. The first sewer tunnels cut by hand, the bylaws about dumping and curfews, the memory of that one summer when everything reeked until the gone farmers returned. There is a humility in this kind of legacy, a quiet lesson about what civilizations really depend on. For every spire that soars above the rooftops, for every square where crowds gather to trade, celebrate, or mourn, there are dark corners where the unglamorous work gets done. We celebrate the kings, the architects, the poets, but the world endures because of those willing to shoulder the burdens others cannot bear. If you listen carefully to the folklore and street songs, you can sometimes hear a glimmer of understanding, even respect. Old ballads remember the night soil men as tricksters, survivors, clever underdogs who could outwit authority or fate. In some tales, the poorest child grows up to save the town, all because he knows what others do not, where the tunnels run, where the waters flow, what lies hidden in the cracks and crevices of the city's foundations. These stories linger on, whispered in back alleys or half-joked at the market, a secret code for those who know that strength is often hidden where nobody thinks to look. In the centuries since pipes replaced buckets and shovels, the work of keeping cities clean has faded into a new kind of invisibility. Today's sanitation workers labor with machines, hazmat suits, and high-pressure hoses, their efforts masked by technology and distance. Yet the basic truth remains unchanged. Someone, somewhere, must still carry away what the rest cannot face. The means have changed, but the cycle, waste, removal, renewal, continues, an ancient rhythm beating beneath the noise of modern life. Perhaps the greatest legacy of the gong farmers is a lesson in humility and interdependence. They remind us, in a world obsessed with surfaces and appearances, that every society is built on the backs and buckets of people we rarely see. They show us that dignity can survive in the darkest places, that pride and solidarity can flourish in the face of universal disdain, and that even the lowest work, done well, holds the power to save a city from itself. To walk the old streets of London, Paris, Rome, or any city born before the age of steel and glass is to walk on ground once tended by their hands. Every lamp-lit lane and every cheerful morning owes something to those who laboured, not for applause, but out of necessity and endurance. Their shadows linger in the cool of the basements, in the hiss of hidden pipes, in the rare, fresh air of a city that against all odds remains habitable. So the next time you pass a man in stained overalls, guiding a garbage truck at dawn, or scrubbing the pavement after a festival, spare a thought for the original keepers of the city's soul, the people under the city, the invisible custodians, the midnight survivors. Their story is our story, hidden beneath the clean surface, waiting to be remembered. Because in the end, every civilization is only as strong as those willing to do its dirtiest work.